The memo was 2 paragraphs long, and the woman reading it aloud gave both the same flat weight, as if the sentence that would end a station's working life deserved no more emphasis than the one before it. The filtration system at the Cutback River Water Reclamation Station is unexplainably non-compliant, she read, and is recommended for immediate decommission pending transfer of equipment. She set the page down on the table the way a person sets down something already decided. Behind her, at the propped open door, a staffer half her age was already waving off the old man standing in it. "Sir, this is a closed hearing. You'll want the visitor's lot out front." Before he is asked to leave, the old man asks only to see the number on the intake gauge, a request granted without anyone remembering when it started, granted so many times by so many different staffers over so many years that it had stopped being a question and become a kind of weather, something the building simply did before he went. 11,000 households drew their water from the lines behind that door. The hearing closed formally at 4 o'clock Thursday, and after that, the order became final. The equipment listed for transfer to auction inventory by Friday morning, and a private contractor 3 counties over had already put in a scrap value bid on the pumps and the filter stacks and the miles of buried pipe nobody in the room had touched with their own hands, in longer than most of them had been alive. Nobody in that room yet knew what the old man in the faded green coveralls had built with his. If you have ever been the one still tending something everyone else has already written off, you already know how this room feels before he says a word. He did not argue with the staffer. He looked past her, the way a man looks past a fence at a field he already knows the shape of, and asked, in a voice pitched for no one but himself, whether someone might let him see the intake gauge before he went. The staffer blinked. Behind her, a young engineering technician glanced up from his clipboard-free notepad. Kellen Ogle, 24, 2 years on the job, the only person in that room who still logged hearings by hand, and something in the request snagged him, though he could not have said what. The old man carried a canvas roll under one arm, cinched with a leather tie gone the color of a saddle, and he held it the way other men held nothing at all, without thinking about it, because it had been part of him longer than the thought of setting it down. "He's not on the docket," the staffer said, already turning away, already reaching to pull the door to. "We're mid-session. He'll have to come back another day." Somewhere down the corridor, a printer finished its run with a small mechanical sigh, and the sound seemed, for a moment, louder than anything anyone in the room had said. The old man did not move to leave. He stood in the doorway with the patience of a man reading weather and waited to see if the door would actually close, or if, as it always had, for reasons the building itself seemed to remember better than its staff, someone would simply let him through. Alton Quimby was 81 years old, and the first thing anyone noticed about him, if they noticed him at all, was that he turned his whole body to look at something rather than reaching for it, the way another man might swivel a chair. His left shoulder would not lift past the height of his own collarbone, hadn't in decades, and he had built a lifetime of small workarounds around that one refusal of the body, turning instead of twisting, setting a tool down on his right rather than passing it across himself, favoring doorways that opened toward that side, so he never had to fight the hinge. Nobody asked him how it happened. He never told anyone who did. His coveralls were faded to the green of a fence post, left too long in weather, pressed with a crease that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with habit, and across the breast, in stitching gone pale as scar tissue, a name still showed, if the light caught it right. Quimby and Son Well Drilling. Though there had never been a son, only a wife who had kept the books and answered the phone and in the last years driven the truck herself when his shoulder wouldn't allow the wheel. The coveralls were 30 years out of any cut a young engineer would call current. He wore them the way some men wear a uniform they were never discharged from, because in every way that mattered to him, he hadn't been. The canvas roll he would not set down held, among its ordered pockets, a brass gauge no longer than his palm, filed by his own hand decades ago to a tolerance he had never written down anywhere but into the metal itself. 3 small hatch marks scored into the housing where a factory gauge would have shown none. It was not much to look at. It had outlived 2 other gauges he'd carried before it, and it would outlive, he suspected without saying so to anyone, him. Every morning, before coffee, before the day asked anything of him at all, Alton Quimby carried that gauge to his kitchen tap and read the water coming through it, a habit that had no purpose left in the world, except the one he had never explained to a living soul. Ruth had asked him to do it the week she got sick, not the treatment plant's water, just the tap, just once a day, just so she'd know, she said, that somebody in the house was still paying attention to what was actually there, instead of what the paperwork said should be there. She had been gone 9 years. He still read the tap every morning, before coffee, the way she'd asked him to that week, and he had never once told anyone why, not because it was a secret he was keeping, but because some rituals lose something the instant they are explained, and he had decided a long time ago that this was one of them. Kira Prescott caught the anomaly at 9:40 that morning, 40 minutes before the hearing was gavelled open, and she caught it the hard way, under a supervisor's eye and a clock that did not care whether she was ready. The regional flow rate summary had come back from the automated system reading 0.6% under expected draw, a number small enough that 2 other reviewers had already initialed past it that week, without a second look. Prescott didn't. She pulled the raw feed, cross-referenced it against the seasonal baseline, caught that the 0.6% wasn't noise, it tracked a pattern, rising in exact step with the intake valve's morning cycle, 3 separate days running, and flagged it to her supervisor 11 minutes before the hearing's start time with a 1-line memo that turned out, by any measure that mattered in that building, to be exactly right. Her supervisor read it twice, said nothing for a moment, that clearly cost him something, and told her to fold it into the compliance summary. It was, in the small currency of that office, a kind of victory, and she had earned it the way she earned most things, by refusing to let a small number lie to her. She carried that same sharpness into the hearing room like a blade she hadn't yet sheathed, and when she turned from the table and saw the old man still standing in the doorway, tool roll under his arm, coveralls 30 years past their season, something in her, not cruelty, never quite cruelty, but the reflex of a young woman who has just been right and wants an audience to confirm it, reached for the easiest laugh in the room. She held up her printed run sheet like a hand of cards and tapped its edge twice against the table, a habit she'd picked up somewhere and never noticed she had. "Somebody check him for ID," she said, loud enough to pitch past the old man to the 2 junior staffers by the window, loud enough to be a joke with a built-in audience. "And whatever that is he's wearing, that's not a uniform, that's a costume from the wrong decade." A ripple of laughter went through the junior end of the room, quick and easy, the kind that costs nothing and means less. Kellen Ogle didn't laugh. He looked down at his notepad and wrote nothing, and the not writing was its own kind of wince, though nobody but the old man seemed to see it. Quimby didn't answer the joke. He looked at Prescott the way he might look at a gauge reading he intended to check twice before trusting, and said nothing at all, which unsettled the junior staffers more than any retort could have, because silence, held long enough, starts to feel like a verdict rather than a defeat. They asked him for credentials first, a man near the door, official enough in his lanyard to feel entitled to the question, wanted to see a badge, a card, anything with a number on it that the building system could look up. Quimby set his tool roll on the floor between his boots, carefully, the way a man sets down something that has never once been dropped, and said that he hadn't carried a badge in 38 years, but that the water coming off the number 2 settling tank was running warmer than the return line by more than it should this time of year, and somebody ought to look at the heat exchanger before the afternoon shift, whether or not anyone believed him about anything else. Nobody checked, but Kellen Ogle wrote it down. They told him next that the hearing was censor verified, not open to public testimony, a phrase Prescott herself supplied, not unkindly, more as a recitation of policy than an insult, though it landed as one anyway, simply by being said to a man standing in a doorway with nowhere else offered to him. Quimby only asked, in return, whether anyone in the room had walked the actual intake line that week, boots on the bank, hand on the pipe, or whether everyone present was reading the same number off the same screen and calling that agreement. Nobody answered him directly. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer, and Kellen Ogle, for reasons he could not yet have named even to himself, began to write faster. The third time, they nearly walked him out bodily. A security officer, summoned by someone's radio call, took Quimby by the arm above the elbow, gently enough, by the standards of such things, but firmly enough that the old man's frozen shoulder dipped an inch lower than it liked to go. And for 1/2 second, something crossed his face that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with an old, private cost being paid again. He didn't pull away. He turned his whole body toward the officer, the way he turned toward everything, and said only that the pressure gauge on the auxiliary line had been reading a hair high since sometime in the spring, and that whoever was writing the compliance numbers off it might want to know that before they signed anything with their name on it. It was the plainness of it that stopped the officer's hand, not the words themselves, which meant little to a man whose job was doors, but the flat, unbothered certainty underneath them, the tone of someone reciting an old fact rather than defending a new grievance. Kellen Ogle looked up from his notepad at that, really looked, for the first time weighing not what the old man said, but the fact that he never once raised his voice to say it, and began, for the wrong reason at first, mistaking calm for simple stubbornness, to suspect there might be something under all that patience, worth checking on paper, rather than dismissing on sight. It was Prescott, in the end, who let him near the line, and she let him near it as a kind of concession. That wasn't. A joke extended one step further than a joke should go. "Fine," she said, waving a hand toward the access hatch at the room's far wall, the one that opened onto 20 feet of exposed intake pipe kept there for training walkthroughs. "You want to read the water so bad? Read it. We'll wait." A few of the junior staff smiled at that, already composing the story they'd tell later about the old man in the wrong decade coveralls who asked to touch a pipe. Quimby knelt at the hatch. Carefully, weight shifted onto the knee that still bent the way he needed it to, the frozen shoulder held tucked and still, and drew the brass gauge from the canvas roll. He did not rush it. He fitted the gauge to the test port with both hands, seated it, waited 3 full seconds by no clock but his own counting, and read the needle once before he touched anything else. Then he checked the intake line's stamped specification plate, dulled with age, but still legible if a man knew where to look and had looked there before. Then he laid 2 fingers flat against the pipe itself, just above the elbow joint, and held them there long enough that the room's laughter, which had started warm, began to cool into something closer to attention. "Sensors reading 41 inches downstream of where the 98 retrofit spec called for it," he said, not loudly, the words landing into a room gone quieter than it meant to be. "Which means it's reading water that's already past the second filter stage, instead of water coming in ahead of it. Your numbers aren't wrong, they're just answering a question nobody's asking anymore." He set the gauge down on the pipe's flat top, exactly where the room could see it, and said nothing further, because the plainest facts, in his experience, needed no company. Prescott's printed run sheet had a great many numbers on it, all of them consistent, all of them internally sound, and not one of them accounted for a sensor placed 41 inches from where its own governing document said it should sit. She looked at the sheet. She looked at the pipe. She looked, finally, at the old man kneeling there, with his hand still resting on brass gone warm from his own palm. And for the first time since she'd walked into that room that morning, she said nothing at all. The regional office moved the hearings close from Thursday afternoon to Wednesday night, before the room had finished absorbing what Quimby had said, and the notice came the way such notices always come, buried inside language that made an urgent thing sound routine, a scheduling adjustment prompted by an unsolicited acquisition inquiry from a private infrastructure firm offering scrap valuation on the station's filtration hardware, contingent on formal decommission being entered into the record before the weekend. 2 days gone, just like that, folded into 6 sentences nobody had voted on. Prescott read the notice twice at her desk, and the second reading cost her something the first hadn't. Her own performance review, due at quarter's end, carried a line item for hearings closed on schedule and without appeal, a number that meant more to her supervisor than any pipe ever would. An old man's claim about a misplaced sensor, however sound it looked kneeling at a hatch, was not a fact her superiors wanted slowing down a signature. She found herself, against the plain evidence of her own eyes an hour before, arguing the other side of it, telling herself the sensor placement might be a documentation error rather than a functional one, that even if the gauge read true, proving it true enough to stop a scheduled decommission was a different, much larger thing than proving it true enough to embarrass a room for an afternoon. She hated, faintly, how easy it was to find the argument. She made it anyway. It was Kellen Ogle who broke the stalemate, and he broke it the way a person breaks a rule they've convinced themselves is smaller than it is. The station kept its original 1998 retrofit documentation in a records room 2 floors down, sealed under a retention exemption that required supervisory sign-off to access, a formality, everyone assumed, for papers nobody had opened in a generation. Ogle went down anyway, on his own authority, which was to say on no authority at all, and pulled the folder himself, rather than waiting on a request that might not clear before Wednesday night closed the whole question for good. He found, in the margin of a materials log page gone soft and brown at the corners, a signature that matched nothing in the digital archive at all. Not a name flagged anywhere in the current system, not a name Prescott's software would ever have surfaced, because the software had never been asked to look. He was still staring at it, turning the page under the records room light, to be sure he wasn't inventing what he saw, when a facilities supervisor found him there and did not care what he'd found. Unauthorized access to sealed retention files was, by the letter of the policy Prescott had recited to Quimby that morning, grounds for immediate suspension pending review, and the supervisor said as much, loudly, in the corridor, in front of enough people that word reached the hearing room before Ogle did. For a quarter of an hour it looked as though the whole thread would be cut at the root. Ogle escorted off the property before he could say what he'd found. Quimby's claim left standing on a kneeling man's word and a brass gauge with no paper behind it, the hearing free to close Wednesday night exactly as scheduled. Quimby, watching from the back of the room, said nothing to defend the boy. He only asked, quietly, whether someone might at least look at the page before deciding whether the boy who found it should be punished for it. A request so plain and so nearly polite that even the supervisor, mid-sentence, found himself pausing to consider it. General Weston Radcliffe arrived at the station a little after 2 that afternoon, and no one in the hearing room had called him there for ceremony. He had been notified because the 1998 retention exemption required, by its own governing clause, a signature from the officer who had originally authorized the file's sealing, and that signature, 31 years old and still binding, was his. He came in wearing a plain civilian coat over a collared shirt, no rank visible anywhere on him, and for a moment nobody in the room recognized him as anyone beyond an older man arriving late to a hearing that concerned him in some bureaucratic way nobody had bothered to explain. He crossed the room without being announced and stopped in front of Alton Quimby, and before anyone could offer an introduction, before Quimby had so much as looked up fully from the hatch where he still knelt, Radcliffe said, in a voice that carried the flat cadence of something memorized decades ago and never forgotten, "Draw from the low port first, let it stand 90 seconds before you read it, and never trust a reading taken cold." He recited it the way a man recites a thing his body remembers better than his mind does, word perfect, unhurried, and then he stood there, in the sudden quiet that followed, holding his own silence like a man who has just handed over something he's carried a long time. Quimby looked up at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at weather he recognizes from a long way off, and said only, "Captain Radcliffe," not a question, a confirmation, offered flat, the way he offered every fact that mattered to him. The room did not yet understand what it was watching, only that it was watching something. Radcliffe, 3-star, retired, chair now of a joint acquisitions review board with more authority in this building than anyone present had accounted for, reached into his coat and produced a single folded page, not the sealed 1998 file itself, but the cover authorization that would release it, already signed, dated that morning before he'd boarded a flight 3 states away to bring it here in person rather than by courier. He set it on the table beside Prescott's run sheet, and for a moment the 2 documents sat there together, one printed that week, one older than most of the people in the room. 52 years ago, Radcliffe said, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once, then Sergeant First Class Quimby pulled me out of a purification line failure in weather that should have killed us both, and taught me everything I know about reading water that isn't telling you the truth on its face. I have never spoken of it publicly, because he never asked me to, and because there are debts a man carries privately, or not at all. He paused, and something in his jaw worked once before he continued. The file I've just released bears my signature. I approved the budget reduction in 1998 that moved that sensor 41 inches downstream to save $11,000 on a $60,000 retrofit. Clearing his name means putting mine into the same sentence. He said it plainly, without asking for absolution, the way a man reads a gauge he already knows the number on. Radcliffe testified without softening any of it. The material substitution that had actually caused the fault, he said, hadn't been his signature alone. The falsified report describing the sensor's placement as spec compliant when it was not had been filed by the regional procurement director at the time, a man named Weldon Dunbar, 14 years dead now, who had rewritten the site drawings after the fact to make a cost-saving change look like an approved engineering decision rather than the quiet cover-up it was. He buried it to protect a budget line, Radcliffe said, and I signed the budget without reading the drawings closely enough to catch what he'd done to hide it. That's mine. I don't offer it as an excuse. I offer it as the record. Prescott had gone very quiet during all of this, her printed run sheet still in her hand, and when Radcliffe finished, she did something none of the junior staff expected. She walked to the access hatch herself, knelt where Quimby had knelt, and measured the distance from the sensor to the specification mark with her own tape, out loud, so the room could hear the number land. 41 inches, she stood, and corrected her run sheet's summary line in front of her own supervisor without being asked to, striking through a conclusion she had defended an hour before. My data was accurate, she said, to the room, to herself, as much as anyone. It was reading the wrong pipe. That's not a flaw in the method. That's a flaw in what somebody let the method measure. It cost her something to say. She said it anyway, and did not look away from Quimby while she said it. When it came time for the room to thank him, Quimby deflected all of it, the way he deflected most things, by turning the subject toward the water rather than himself. He asked only two things, that the station keep running rather than be sold for scrap, and that Kellen Ogle face no discipline for pulling a page that had needed pulling for 27 years. Then, because the room had gone quiet enough to actually hear him, he opened the canvas tool roll one pocket further than he had opened it all day, and drew out, folded behind the brass gauge, a single ledger page, soft at its creases, in a handwriting that was not his own. It listed, in a column headed by a date decades old, the names of a family, an address, and a line reading, in full. No charge, well ran dry. 3 children, paid in garden vegetables through the fall. My wife kept the books, he said, and nothing more, and did not need to. 4 months later, the Cutback River station ran under a corrected specification. The sensor moved back the 41 inches it had always been owed, and the compliance file that closed the matter carried 3 signatures instead of 1 buried mistake, Radcliffe's, Prescott's, and, at the bottom, in a hand that had not signed an official document in nearly 40 years, Alton Quimby's, added at his own quiet insistence beside the words, Consulting Engineer, Original Retrofit. Prescott had changed one habit that nobody had to ask her to change. Before she trusted a single printed sheet now, she walked the physical line first, boots on the bank, hand on the pipe, the way the old man had asked the room to do that first morning, back when nobody thought the asking mattered. The hearing room door, the same door a staffer had once waved him away from as a wandering trespasser, stood propped open on the afternoon he came back to see the finished work, and it was that same staffer, older now only by 4 months, but visibly changed in some smaller way, who held it for him without being told to, and said nothing at all, which was, from her, its own kind of apology finally paid. He still tests the gauge on the kitchen tap every morning before coffee, the way she asked him to, the week she got sick, and he has never once told anyone why. The brass gauge hangs back on its nail beside the station's new intake valve, and beside it, in a frame no one asked him to hang, Ruth's ledger page listing the first family they ever helped for nothing. Some rooms only go quiet for rank. This one went quiet for the man who built what the rank was protecting.